David probably won't admit this to most people, but he does occasionally climb inside skips and have a look around. You have done this, haven't you? I once said to him, "How did you find Alfred Hitchcock's accountant's papers?" And he said, "Well, they were in a skip." And I said, but how did you know? And he said, "Well, I got in, of course."
That's Joss. Her and her husband David have remodelled a disused care home at the top of Stanhope Road in Deal into a 3-storey high film museum dedicated to the history of the moving image.
I started collecting because in my first job at the National Film Archive, the view at the time was still that cinema started in 1895, and so when we were offered items of pre-cinema material, magic lanterns, optical toys and things like that, the archive always turned them down. But I always felt, no, there's a relationship here, and so I started collecting pre-cinema material. Film didn't just appear in 1895, it effectively was a step in a period of development that had started way back with the cave painting and the shadow play. We feel that you need to tell the whole story if you're to understand any part of it, and so that's what we try and do in the museum.
The downstairs of the museum is home to Joss's favourite exhibition called 35,000 Years to Catch a Shadow. It focuses on the relationship between light, shadow and the birth of photography.
We're all intrigued by our shadows, as children in particular. Actually, interestingly, up to the age of 5, children will draw their shadows detached from their bodies. They view them as something else, something different. They only attach them a little bit later. I find that very fascinating psychologically.
Many believe that humans started cave painting and creating art as a whole after noticing patterns made by our shadows.
What this exhibition does is take us from those first moments of creating art in the cave with its flickering shadows, which then become pictures on the wall, all the way up through shadow theatre in Asia, up to shadow theatre in Turkey and Greece, into the era of the silhouette, which became a craze in the 18th century and was revived again in the 19th. Then there's this big moment when the photograph arrives in human history, as it were.
Photographs would sometimes be called sun or shadow pictures and were initially advertised as a way to challenge our perception of time, give us a strong sense of identity, and to preserve our own existence for generations to come.
There was a lovely advertising jingle for one Victorian photographer which went, "Secure the shadow ere the substance fade. Let nature imitate what nature made." In other words, pin your shadow down now because your body is going to evaporate. You're going to die, and you can hold back mortality by having yourself photographed at my studio, price only 2 shillings and 6pence, you know, that kind of thing.
After the arrival of the photograph, it was only a matter of time before motion pictures began. If you think about it, you can still see light and shadow at the core of most film genres today.
If you think of horror films, for example, and how important shadow play can be in horror films, the shadow falls across the floor. You don't yet see the creature. You know what I mean? That's an absolute cliche of the horror film, but it's still entrancing and very frightening and very often very well done. Or there's the genre of film noir, which arose, as you know, in America in the 1940s with those hard-boiled detective stories and the flickering lights and all that stuff.
After David retired from the Library of National Congress in Washington, D.C., and Joss from Indiana University Bloomington, the couple wanted to return to the UK with their own archive of film materials and find the perfect place to open their museum.
One of Joss's younger sisters lived in Deal and we came and stayed with her and her partner, and we loved it so much we said, oh no, there's no ties to go anywhere else, why don't we go to Deal? It's not the ideal place, on a little promontory way away from everything else. Nobody passes through Deal to go anywhere, but actually the population of Deal is, I think, just right as far as we're concerned. I mean, the number of people who come into the museum who are connected in some way or other with museums, with film, with television, with art, etc., means that we have a wonderful base. We may never be crowded, but we'll always be happy.
The upstairs of the museum is dedicated to the films and the posters of Ealing Studios.
When we first opened, on the very first day, the first hour of the first day, a rather shy, very nice woman, about my age, came to the door, entered the museum, She was nervous, a little bit hesitant. I tried to put her at her ease. She said, I'm particularly interested in your Ealing exhibition. We got chatted because I feel very passionate about those posters. It's the only time in film history when established and rising fine artists were asked to create posters. It's really a unique moment in history. Anyway, we got chatting, she relaxed, and then she said, by the way, do you know much about S. John Woods? And I said, well, I mean, he's the most important figure in this exhibition because he was the artist who became the publicity director of Ealing Studios, and he created some of the posters himself. So I said, but we can't find out much about him. He's sort of disappeared. There's very little written about him. And she said, well, he was my father and he lived 2 streets away. He lived in Deal. With great kindness, the family of S. John Woods have loaned us some of his personal material. So the paintbrushes with which he created things, his Letraset sets, even the apron in which he painted.
So as the world migrates from VHS to DVDs to Netflix and the cloud, why is it important to preserve pre-cinema material and film in a museum like this?
That's such a big question. And I've got a sort of a philosophical take on that. Cinema was the great art of the 20th century. It absorbed the greatest creative energies of some of the greatest artists of the 20th century. It was a social and cultural phenomenon. It intervened in history. If you're not interested in that, you're not alive and you're not human. Film is a very significant art form.
The museum has been under construction since 2012. It finally opened its doors in March 2018.